Hello, everyone. My name is Lindsay Shearer, and I am a Child Protection and Emergencies Advisor with Save the Children. I'd like to welcome you all to the Sexual and Gender-Based Violence webcast that I'll be presenting to you today. I hope you enjoy it and learn lots and lots. There are some learning objectives for this webcast. We hope that you're able to have a good understanding of the definitions of sexual and gender-based violence, a good understanding of specific risks for children in humanitarian settings, and are able to list some of the best practices related to prevention, mitigation, and response when setting up and running a sexual and gender-based violence program. I think all of you will be aware and hopefully familiar with the Child Protection Minimum Standards. Copies can be purchased and delivered to your door if not. However, I would like to reference Chapter 9. This is the new chapter in the revised version of the Child Protection Minimum Standards, which pulls together the previous chapters that were based on sexual violence and harmful practices. Let's take a closer look at the standard. What does the standard ask us to achieve? All children are informed about and protected from sexual and gender-based violence and have access to survivor-centred response services appropriate to their gender, age, disability, developmental stage, and cultural religious background. So it captures quite a lot. The revised version by the Alliance decided to combine sexual violence, gender-based violence, and harmful practices altogether. There is some debate over combining sexual violence and gender-based violence. However, in the child protection sphere, there was a decision to ensure that the risks and needs of both boys and girls were covered and responded to. With the broader focus, the chapter provides us with more guidance and details to dig into the root causes of sexual and gender-based violence, ensuring we look at social and gender norms within a country context and analysis and understand any norms that promote gender-based discrimination or unequal power, which we often see impacting children in crisis situations. The chapter very much guides us to providing interventions aimed at gender equality and systemic change to social and gender norms. The chapter outlines our key guiding principles related to a survivor-centred approach. Can you take a guess what they are? Respect, safety, confidentiality, and of course, non-discrimination. I can probably hear some of you now asking, but what about the best interest of the child? Well, do not worry. In the case of child survivors, we should ensure that these 4 principles are implemented with the best interest of the child. It is also recognised that all children are unique and will be affected uniquely by any type of SGBV. The chapter also has strengthened its approach to age, gender, and diversity, and emphasises the needs of children with disabilities, as well as looking at sexual orientation and gender identity. On sector coordination, there is recognition to link up with our GBV friends and colleagues to coordinate our preparedness, programming, and data collection. So there's lots for us to get our teeth stuck into. Before we go any further, we should take a look at the definitions and ensure that we're all on the same page regarding terms before moving forward. As you can see on the slide, sexual violence is defined as any form of sexual activity with a child by an adult or by another child who has power over the child. Power is a very important word to take note of here. Sexual violence includes both activities with and without bodily contact. These include the inducement or coercion of a child to engage in any unlawful or psychologically harmful sexual activity, the use of children in commercial sexual exploitation, the use of children in audio or visual images of child sexual abuse, including online grooming, which became even more of a concern during COVID. Child sexual exploitation, sexual slavery, sexual exploitation in travel and tourism, trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation within and between countries, sale of children for sexual purposes, and forced marriage. For gender-based violence, this is the umbrella term for any harmful act that is perpetrated against a person's will and that is based on socially ascribed differences between males and females. It includes acts that inflict physical, sexual, or mental harm or suffering, threats of such acts, coercion, and any other deprivations of liberty. This can be girls who are not allowed to attend school, or boys who are forced to join armed groups or forces. So we've heard a little about what the definitions mean, but let's have a quick look at some different types of SGBV that you may have heard of, or that you may not have realised were under the SGBV umbrella. Have a look at this slide at the different words here. I will give you a moment to take in some of the words and will ask you to reflect and think about which words are more related to sexual violence and which are GBV. Think about if any are specific to girls or boys. You might also want to think about, are there any differences for children and adults when it comes to SGBV? So as I mentioned, sexual and gender-based violence is an abuse of unequal power relationships. Power is directly linked to choice. It is important for us to remember as child protection actors that children have less power, have fewer choices, and are more vulnerable to abuse than adults. There are some types of sexual and gender-based violence that are more likely to affect girls or boys of different ages. But all girls and boys face risks of SGBV. These risks can vary in different cultures and contexts. Again, it is important that we as child protection actors have a strong understanding of the culture and social norms in order to identify the risks for children and find ways to better protect them. Adults and children can both be affected by the same types of sexual and gender-based violence, such as sexual violence and abuse, domestic violence, denial of access to land, inheritance rights, trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation, discriminatory access to services, forced marriage, and so on. However, there are also some types of sexual gender-based violence that affect only or especially children, such as child marriage, genital mutilation or cutting, discriminatory access to education, online child abuse, and infanticide, child soldiers, or the use of children in armed groups, armed forces. I would also like to add that children rarely disclose sexual abuse and exploitation for a number of different reasons. This can be due to their maturity and ability to understand what's happened to them. Perhaps it's not knowing their rights or legislation. Also, it can be this feeling of shame or blaming themselves. Also, they can be afraid that they will not be believed. It is vital we keep this in mind when preparing a programme to identify and respond to the needs of children, and that staff are well trained to understand SGBV from a child's perspective. Before we enter into the world of humanitarian or crisis settings, we should understand that SGBV is happening everywhere and in every context. Thus, when we have a humanitarian crisis, the risks and prevalence of SGBV is likely to go up. And as child protection actors, we have a lot of urgent needs to take care of, but by ensuring we weave the SGBV standards into our programming, we can keep a focus on this issue. In the aftermath of a disaster or conflict, there are many factors that can contribute to putting children at further risk of SGBV. And we know many of these already. The disruption of protective structures, which could be related to having a safe home destroyed, being separated from your caregiver or loved ones, having been moved to a new unknown location with particular hazards, traffickers looking for vulnerable children. Often there is weakened rule of law that makes the space easier for people to exploit children. Displacement and difficult journeys pose all sorts of risks en route. In conflict settings, children can be forced to join armed groups or forces, fighting on the front line, or being forced to be wives, exposing them to rape or other forms of sexual violence. Okay, let's mix things up a little bit and give you a chance to think about some statements that you're going to see on the following slides. And we can think about whether these are a myth, so not true, or they are reality, true. Let's go to the first slide. Sexual abuse of children is not a problem in this country or context where I work. This is a myth. Sexual abuse is a problem globally and in all contexts. In situations of displacement, crisis, the vulnerability of boys and girls is increased. We have also seen this in the global pandemic of COVID-19. Okay, get ready for the next one. Children with disabilities are more at risk of SGBV than other children. This is a reality. Children with disabilities are indeed more at risk of certain forms of sexual gender-based violence, especially sexual violence, since they can be or are perceived to be less able to defend themselves or to run away. They are often more dependent on others for support and daily functioning and are less able to report abuse. Okay, boys are very rarely victims of SGBV. This is a myth. A recent UNICEF survey found that globally and outside of the context of conflict and displacement, 1 in 10 girls and 1 in 25 boys are survivors of sexual violence. So while boys may be less at risk, 4% of boys are survivors of sexual violence. Depending on the context, boys might be just as at risk as girls are. In some conflict settings, we have seen that boys are subjected to sexualized forms of torture. Furthermore, other forms of SGBV, such as child marriage, physical abuse, and initiation of coming-of-age ceremonies, which subject young boys to acts of violence to prove they are strong and capable of being men, can also significantly affect boys. Like girls, not many boys report abuse, so we should never assume that no reports mean no risk. Okay, next slide. In most cases of sexual violence against children, the perpetrator is known to the child. This is a reality. Most cases of sexual abuse of children are committed by a family member, neighbor, teacher, or other person close to the child. There are also cases of child-to-child abuse. This can make it especially difficult for children to report abuse and to bring the perpetrators to justice. Okay, that's the small quiz food for thought for you. Now we're going to move on to SGBV, impacts of SGBV on children and the importance of understanding legislation to support our work on SGBV. It is important to remember that all forms of sexual and gender-based violence are a violation of the rights of children. They have negative impacts on the girl and boy's health. They have negative impact on their social development, and they perpetuate power inequalities in interpersonal relations and within society. SGBV causes long-lasting physical, psychological, and/or sexual damage, or even as far as death of a child. It can affect children's physical, mental, sexual, and reproductive health, their self-esteem, their ability to work, and to make decisions about their own fertility. For example, for girls, types of SGBV can lead to teenage pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, which gone untreated can lead to further health complications, HIV/AIDS, chronic pelvic pain, and other health issues. Boys can also face issues of becoming a father as a child and also sexually transmitted diseases. Sexual and gender-based violence can also impact their social development. By depriving children of the environment and the means to fully develop their potential, for example, when they are taken or denied access to education, children can become desensitized to suffering. They may learn to see the use of violence as a legitimate means to achieve their own aims through witnessing or experiencing domestic or intimate partner violence, or through roles within armed groups or forces. Gender-based violence perpetuates power inequalities in interpersonal relations and in society, thus reproducing the structures that enable gender-based violence to exist. An overwhelming factor at the heart of gender-based violence is the inequality between women, girls, and men or boys, and the discrimination that women and girls face within society as a whole. Economic and social underdevelopment is in itself an expression of unequal power relations and violence. Moreover, gender-based violence is the ultimate means of enforcing unequal social, economic, and political relations between women and men at all levels of society and in all countries of. This goes back to our earlier slide on the need to understand social norms and how we can support behaviour change, not just at an individual level, but at societal level. Let's take a quick look at the legislation and how conventions and international laws support the prevention of SGBV. International law provides special protection for children, and I'm sure all of you will have heard of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, the CRC, which we have referenced some of the articles on the slide that you can see. Any child is anyone under 18 years old, non-discrimination, the best interest of the child, family life and guidance is essential for children. Children have the right to be protected from violence, exploitation, abuse, and neglect. Children have the right to be protected from all forms of sexual abuse. Children have the right for protection from being punished at school. And there's the optional protocol relating to involvement of children in armed conflict. There are other international laws and conventions that are related to child protection and SGBV. This includes CEDAW, the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This has articles relating to child marriage. Another example is the African Committee on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, where there are articles relating to harmful social and cultural practices. There are other examples as well. The prevention of SGBV is definitely something that will take place over a long period of time. It needs to address the root causes of inequality by promoting the rights of women and girls and marginalised groups. In order to change certain gender norms, we really need to engage everyone to create an understanding of the issues different groups face. This certainly includes activities that engage men and boys as advocates of gender equality and ending SGBV. It is vital that we advocate for policies and laws that support equality and access to services for all. Some of these activities might seem challenging for humanitarian actors and may need a long-term approach, but we should be aware that a lot can be done in a crisis to move forward equality and prevent SGBV. Ensuring SGBV is highlighted in emergency preparedness plans, identifying vulnerable groups, key risks, is a great step in preventing further harm and following do no harm programming. Multi-sector approaches can prevent the use of positive coping mechanisms, taking an example of child marriage, where sectors such as social protection, education, and health work together. I would just like you to take a moment here to see if you can understand what is happening in these photos, as some interesting prevention activities are taking place in Bangladesh and Nepal. Take a moment to write down your thoughts in your book or just think about them in your head. I really love some of these approaches. They are really creative ways of engaging communities to discuss with adolescents issues and perspectives and take forward some of these issues in the community. These are just two examples here, but there are many more that can inspire your work. The first is in Bangladesh. It's a picture of adolescents using street drama and dialogue to challenge existing social norms and show positive alternatives. The second one is in Nepal. It's an intergenerational dialogue. You can see in the picture the older generation talking to the adolescent youth. Adolescents and their parents are bridging the gap to better understand adolescents' aspirations. These are really a step one to start the process of change to greater equality and hopefully creating a shift in power that will prevent forms of SGBV for children. Let's take a look at mitigation. This mitigation part looks a little like the prevention slide, but here we really are trying to have a continuous grasp of understanding of the changing context. This is certainly where we need humanitarian actors to be continuously assessing the situation for boys, girls, and children of diversity, particularly in settings such as conflict or displacement. From my experience, I have seen hazard mapping tools completed where boys and girls work in separate groups to map out their concerns and views on what and who is safe or unsafe. Conducting these mapping exercises on such a taboo subject can take a certain amount of trust building before you actually find out some of the real issues. This is why it's important to conduct these safety mappings on a regular basis. Trust is very important in this exercise. You also should not expect to or ask directly to a child who an abuser is or if there is any SGBV happening in their community. Questions can be more subtle, as needs to be the analysis of what you're being told. It's also useful to work with the community to set up monitoring systems for SGBV and provide continuous information that supports children and families to understand SGBV and its risks. This is often done through child protection groups or committees or peer-to-peer forums. So what can we do in our programming to ensure that we do not let vulnerable children fall through the cracks or expose them to further harm? It is important for everyone to recognise that SGBV is a life-threatening issue and follow global guidelines such as the CPMS and GBV guidelines. The slide lists out some basics that should be in place for SGBV programming. Understanding the context and the culture, social and gender norms helps frame any program response, including prevention and mitigation. Ensuring that there are services and referral pathways for SGBV so survivors can access services and receive an appropriate response. Reporting of SGBV can be hindered by the risks of stigma and further violence. This multiplies the physical, mental, and social effects of SGBV for the survivor. Thus, it is so important that frontline workers and service providers are able to provide age and gender sensitive responses and services for boys and girls and for diverse groups considering sexual orientation and gender identification. It is important there are confidential referral pathways to better protect the survivor and their rights. Understanding the rights of the survivor and supporting them to access their rights with informed consent is essential to support the survivor through the healing process. Through this process, responders must practice the key principles of safety, respect, confidentiality, and non-discrimination. It is also important to care for any staff that are frontline workers or caseworkers by having a system of coaching and supervision that includes well-being, as caseworkers can also be affected. It is important to remember that children with disabilities are a vulnerable group and at risk when it comes to SGBV. It is important to ensure that our frontline workers are trained and aware on how to spot signs of SGBV, as well as understand and identify barriers in communication, attitudes towards children with disabilities in the community, and policies that children with disabilities face in accessing survivor support services. We go back to some of the key messages in the CPMS on understanding social norms, policies, laws, and level of service provision, consulting with children with disabilities and their caregivers and community members to design and overcome obstacles such as barriers to services. Simple suggestions such as provision of transportation, interpreters for the hearing impaired can help. Setting up systems where data is disaggregated into disability, sex, and age can also ensure children receive an appropriate response. Where you feel you do not have enough experience to train on approaches to work with children with disabilities, pair up with a local disability organisation who have experience in this field and who can support the development of specific approaches for SGBV programming, from design of awareness messaging to developing SOPs that support respect, consent, confidentiality, and non-discrimination. Often we come across situations where we have little service provision to refer SGBV cases, or where we are a non-specialist and don't know what to do. Fortunately, there's a superb guide to provide support and guidance for that. The first step, you always talk to a GBV or child protection specialist in your country or context, first to understand what services are available in your area, and two, the local protocols and procedures. Do no harm. Do not seek out child survivors. It's not your job to investigate or assess if a child or adolescent is experiencing violence. Doing so can lead to more violence and risks for the child or adolescent. However, do be approachable if a child or adolescent wants to seek your help. So our role really is to set up channels where we can identify if issues are arising and systems where people can seek support. Do remember your role. The main message is, if a child does disclose, it's very much like psychological first aid. Look, listen, and link to SGBV services. Also, we should bear in mind the key principles, of course, of respect, safety, confidentiality, and non-discrimination. As you can see from the slide, it's important to treat every child fairly, maintain confidentiality, and ensure the safety of the child. The physical and emotional safety of the child is the primary concern. Consider the child's safety throughout all interactions with him or her and in relation to any next steps taken. So we've come to the end of our webcast, so let's recap what we've learned. I hope that you are now more confident to define sexual and gender-based violence and give examples of the different types that exist, that you're able to understand gender-specific risks and list examples of best practices, key considerations of prevention, mitigation, and response. We have also outlined some resources here that I hope you should find helpful. And we've also added a special video on consent that outlines it in a clear and informative way. I hope you find these guidance tools useful and wish you luck in your future programming. Thank you for listening.